Excellent. So glad to see a packed room, and so glad that the last discussion stole a lot of our thunder by immediately examining U.S. foreign policy, which is what Hala and I will also do. But I want to build directly on what the last discussant said, which is that the United States government, its foreign policy, makes a lot of trade-offs. They trade away democracy and human rights for economics and security. And yet it seems that given these trades, the United States still doesn't get the security benefits, the access to oil, and all of the deals that they want. So they seem to be trading away democracy and human rights for very little in return. So with that comment to inspire us, I just wanted to ask you, Hala, having a career spanning, I mean, not just your recent posting, but across the Middle East and with deep Middle East expertise, what's your biggest takeaway from your career in the MENA about sort of the failures and impact of U.S. foreign policy and what needs to change now?
Thank you, Tess. First of all, I just want to say congratulations on MEDC's launch. Really. I'm so thrilled to be here, and I'm honestly quite overwhelmed by the turnout, and I just want to thank you all for your interest and for coming out tonight. Really, I mean that from the bottom of my heart. So my biggest takeaways really are twofold. One, that we don't learn from our mistakes. We unfortunately have not been learning from our mistakes. And two, that we are continuing to undermine and underestimate, for lack of a better word, the Arab street. Right? So when I joined the State Department 18 years ago, I had this notion of if only my government understood, if only they knew, if only they had additional information, they would make the right decisions. Unfortunately, I ended my career in resignation, so there's been a lot of frustration there. But we've all seen the trajectory over the last decades. Many of us had hope when Barack Obama had his famous speech in Cairo. And he said, we will prioritize human rights. We will prioritize democracy. And we understand that the only way to achieve true stability and really have partners in the Middle East that are sustainable is for us to prioritize that over security, over oil deals. But then we all saw how the Obama administration went. And then when President Biden was on the campaign trail, we all listened to the rhetoric specifically about Saudi Arabia and around Jamal Khashoggi and around the need for press freedom and human rights. And every time as a diplomat, I was proud, I had hope. I thought we would make a change finally. And I can say some of our rhetoric has changed, especially under democratic leadership, but our policies have not. They've remained the same. No matter if it's a Bush White House, a Trump White House, an Obama White House, and now a Biden White House. And that has been absolutely devastating to see. And we see that it is to our detriment as the US government. And that has been my point, and as Tess has mentioned. It's not a matter of we're promoting human rights and democracy because we want to be nice to the Arabs. It's because it is a fundamental human rights issue. And it is also in our own US national security. It's that simple and it's that clear. And we continue to see a situation in the Middle East that is perpetually unstable. And that leads to my second point of we continue to underestimate, for lack of a better word, the Arab street. There's always this notion that at the leadership level, we make deals, right? Or in this latest instance, Secretary Blinken flies in, he shakes some hands, he makes some concessions, he hits some promises, and he leaves, assuming that things will remain quiet. Part of my role as Arabic language spokesperson was to monitor Arab media. And although this was not shown on traditional Arab media, such as the pan-Arab outlets, it was shown on social media, the growing unrest throughout the Arab world. Protests practically in every country. Yet, as a US government, I can tell you from where I sat just a month ago, the State Department is not focused on that. Still, the State Department is not planning, what are we going to do about this social unrest? Just like before the Arab Spring, all of a sudden, why are millions of people protesting in the streets? What's going on? Why are these regimes being toppled? yet we continue to underestimate the populations across the Arab world. And again, it is to the detriment of our own US national security interests. So my two takeaways, not the most hopeful, but.
Thank you, Hala. And I forgot to mention at the outset that you have the rare pleasure of having two former, longtime US government officials up here. So our level of pessimism and jadedness hopefully has not suffused the room.
We'll end in hope. We'll
end in hope, I promise. We'll end this discussion in hope. But I really wanted to build on what Hala said, which is, we are at this terrible inflection point, the war in Gaza, like everything that's going on, but in a way, it's a continuation of what we've seen for decades and through administrations. I was in, as Arwa mentioned, since the George W. Bush administration, since the Freedom Agenda, since lip service to democracy and human rights. In fact, weaponizing democracy and human rights as reasons for invasion, as reasons for death and destruction. And so this narrative, this approach is not foreign or unknown to all of us who stand up for democracy and human rights in the region. And something I will say as well about the national security issue that I know Hala and I are both touching on is that not only is supporting democracy and human rights the right thing to do, the moral thing to do, it is also what you do for the safety and security of your own country, of the globe, of the region, of countries in the Middle East, and that is a connection that has been lost for so long. You still see it with the war in Gaza, that the Abraham Accords and normalization with Saudi and a deal with Saudi that involves civilian nuclear power and a security guarantee that would tie us to responding to any and all threats that Saudi ever faces, which is fundamentally a huge change in foreign policy, a fundamentally huge change for what the United States would be responsible for and involved in the region, are floated as reasonable, doable foreign policy choices just in general, and now in response to a massive, massive human rights and humanitarian crisis. So we just feel this snowball effect of the previous discussants as well, saying it's been decades and the dehumanization continues and this lack of understanding continues. So on that topic, we obviously can't get away specifically, Hala, from why you resigned. Obviously, the administration's support for the Israeli war in Gaza, provision of arms, its rhetoric. And so I wanted us to dive into what are the practical consequences of US foreign policy in the war in Gaza? What are the practical consequences for affecting the security and prosperity of the United States, of people in Gaza, Israel, and the region?
The consequences are absolutely disastrous, and consequences that I, in my 18-year career, never imagined seeing. So when I joined the State Department, I started off my career in Yemen. That was not an easy time. It was at the height of Gitmo, the most amount of Yemenis, the most amount of population in Guantanamo were Yemenis. You know, it was never easy to be an American diplomat in the Arab world, right? But I would say this is the worst time that I've ever seen, including the Gulf War, in terms of how much disappointment, and I would also say the word hatred towards the United States there is right now in the Arab world. And for me, as an American diplomat, and obviously as an Arab American, it's devastating. It's devastating to get to that place, especially when we had made so much progress, at least on a people-to-people tie. But what I've been explaining to people in the government when I was still in, and now what I've been doing this week at The Hill, is explaining how much we've lost full credibility. And our esteemed guests earlier discussed this. When we are going against our own values of freedom of press or human rights, we are undermining our own credibility. We have no more respect. No one in the Arab world at this point, and I know I'm speaking in generalities, but really has respect for anything that we say anymore, and that's a devastating consequence. And I would say, as I mentioned, in terms of the social unrest, it's destabilizing. It's destabilizing to the entire region. So it's not just about Gaza, it's not just about Israel, and obviously we could talk for hours about the devastation on the Palestinian people themselves. But it's the entire MENA region at this point is impacted and is destabilized by what's going on. And that is, again, going back to this is all a threat to our own US national security.
Yeah, thank you, Hala. And I think to that point of this is bigger than Gaza, and this is bigger than the war in that it affects our security in the United States, but also the region, is that human rights defenders and democracy advocates across the region are also suffering these consequences. You talk to anybody in Egypt, Tunisia, the Gulf, is that the war in Gaza dominates their treatment in their own countries, their feelings of safety, their ability to protest their own treatment or protest the war in Gaza. We saw like 18 Egyptian women protesting the war in Sudan, protesting the war in Gaza, arrested by state security services in Egypt because they were protesting, right? So in exercising their fundamental freedoms and their human rights in their own countries has become even more dangerous because of the war in Gaza and its ripple effects. And so this gets to something I think that Thayer said, which is this is about not just democracy even in the MENA, this is about democracy globally, crisis of credibility, the crisis of does it matter? Our team talks to human rights defenders across the region who said if a country like the United States, if Western allies can just be okay with hundreds of thousands of people being displaced and killed and all of this, and in fact aid and abet it, and say at the same time that democracy is at the center of their foreign policy, why should I endanger my life to stand up for it? Why should I make myself extremely vulnerable to stand up for this when I know I will get no support and in fact be put in greater danger? So it's a crisis of confidence and partnership with the United States government and with the United States people and with the United States NGOs like MEDC and others in this room that we're facing with this war. So this has been sort of a bad news parade, which I understand, and none of us are unfamiliar with the bad news parade. So I want to try to do what Hala promised at the beginning and see if we can end on a positive note, which is given all this hopelessness, given this inflection point where it really feels like support for democracy and human rights has sort of spiraled out of control, what can we do about it? How can we affect change, even incremental small steps that we know we're building to something greater?
You should just resign. Just kidding. Just kidding. I absolutely am not advocating for people to resign. That was a joke. In all seriousness, use your voice. Use your voice. And I don't say that just, casually. I think we all underestimate the power of our own voice. From the very beginning of the crisis, I was a spokesperson based out in Dubai. And so I was supposed to be one of the faces of the US government in the Arab world. So before this actual, I'm not going to call it a crisis, I'm not going to call it a war, I'm going to call it a genocide, was before I had done well over 100 interviews on Arab media. But after the conflict began, and I could see the rise of anti-American sentiment, and I could see the fact that our talking points were being utterly rejected by the entire region. I refused to do interviews because, again, as a diplomat, my job was not just to follow orders and do what I was told. It was to advance US foreign policy. It was to advance US interests. But when we see that something is contrary to that, say something, do something. No matter what your particular position is, use your expertise. And I think there is a climate of fear right now across not just the government, but our entire society. And I can tell you it was very telling for me after my resignation became announced internally, because before it was announced externally, while I was still working, but I just had a couple weeks left, so many diplomats came to me and said, thank you. You speak out when you leave. But it actually made me so sad because they all were too scared to speak out. That's not who we are as Americans. That should not be who we are as a country. And that is not an effective government. An effective government is one that hears from its experts, that hears from its citizens, that hears from its bureaucrats. And that's what makes us stronger. We hear this rhetoric from Secretary Blinken. Honestly, in my experience, it was not the case that it was necessarily welcomed, but because there's this climate of fear. And I think if more people collectively begin to use their voice, that will change. So break through that fear. break through it. Speak to your colleagues. Speak to others in other agencies if you work at a particular government agency. It's very hard as a government employee to also get fired. I'm not advocating for anybody to do anything, but I'm saying it is true. It's hard. We are at such an unprecedented time that everyone's voice matters. So go extra and beyond. If you work at a particular government agency, go and meet with NGO. Use a collective, and don't be scared to do so. There is more power in your voice than you think. And the last thing I would say is know your audience, right? So just to give you an example, I've had meetings on the Hill all week this week. And I framed all of my conversations in terms of US national security interests. I did not discuss the plight of the Palestinians because unfortunately, as it's been mentioned, Palestinians have been dehumanized, and I don't want to feed into that. But if you are a congressperson that still has not been moved by the fact that 15,000 children in Gaza have been massacred, I don't think a conversation with me is going to change your mind on that, unfortunately. But the threat to US national security might, and that is a true threat. It is something that has been overlooked, and it is something that we all, as a collective, need to discuss. Because there's been this us versus them narrative. Push back against this us versus them. It's not about that. It's about humanity, and it's about the United States, and what's good for us and what's good for the collective, including Israel, including the Palestinians, including the broader Middle East and North Africa. So those are a few words that I would say.
Thank you, Hala. We're getting to the end now. It's very exciting. You can smell the sliders. And I just wanted to reinforce what Hala said, which is it's very hard in a dehumanizing, awful space in which we work to think that there can be no progress. But progress is incremental and progress is pragmatic. Progress is talking to government officials and congresspeople of all political parties, of tailoring your message. Progress is finding people in this room who you work with or maybe who you don't work with, other NGOs, other advocacy groups, other democracy implementing partners, and building community and building solidarity and finding opportunities to collaborate, finding venues where you can talk to either senior or mid-level people in the administration, in the government, not just the State Department, not just USAID, maybe Commerce, maybe Treasury, maybe the Department of Defense, people who want to listen, people who will take your facts and your information and even nudge just a little bit, because that's the business of democracy and human rights. I think all of us have realized it is the business of nudging. It is rarely the business of transformation, but to get to that transformational point, all the authoritarians collaborate with one another, so all of us have to collaborate with one another.
You're here.
So thank you for coming back to Arwa to close us out, and thank you, Hala. Thank you.